The first thing I noticed about the hitchhiker was the shadow. It stretched across the shoulder of the highway and pointed straight at my windshield. That alone was wrong. The only light source was behind me, my headlights spilling forward along the empty road, carving two pale lanes through the darkness. Whatever shadow the person cast should have fallen behind them, toward the trees, long and thin along the gravel. Instead it reached forward, toward me. I slowed instinctively. The highway had been empty for miles. No towns, no houses, no reflective mailboxes along the roadside. Just guardrail, black trees, and the faint silver ribbon of asphalt unspooling through the hills. The hitchhiker stood where the shoulder widened briefly before the road bent into another dark stretch. One arm lifted, thumb out. A normal silhouette, jacket, backpack strap across one shoulder. Head slightly bowed against the wind of passing cars, though there were none. But their shadow leaned forward along the gravel like it was trying to crawl under my car. My first thought was that it had to be the angle of the headlights. You see strange things on rural roads at night. Distances flatten. Light bends around dust and mist. Sometimes the eyes invent depth where there isn't any. Still, I eased my foot off the gas. The engine dropped into a quieter hum. The hitchhiker remained still except for the slow lift of their arm. A small, deliberate wave. The shadow did not match the movement. It stayed stretched toward me, one dark arm extended farther than the hitchhiker's real one, long enough that the tip of it crossed the center line of the road. I frowned and leaned slightly forward over the wheel. My headlights were bright, new bulbs, installed a few months ago. Clean beam, straight throw. No other light around for miles. No street lamp, no passing vehicle, no moon visible through the cloud cover. Nothing that should have cast a shadow toward the light. I slowed further, down to maybe 30. The gravel shoulder brightened under the headlights. The hitchhiker's jacket looked gray now. Canvas, maybe. The kind hikers wear when they've been walking a long time. They were facing the road, but their head remained slightly turned away from the beam. Not shielding their eyes, just angled, as if listening to something beyond the trees. Their shadow crept another inch closer to my car. Not lengthening, moving. The distinction settled in my stomach slowly. Shadows stretch when the light moves. Mine hadn't. The front of my car rolled forward another few yards, but the shadow didn't stretch or thin the way it should have. Instead it slid across the gravel with a quiet steadiness, like something dragged over a tabletop. I checked the dashboard clock out of reflex. 1:42 a.m. The digital glow looked oddly bright against the darkness outside. When I looked up again, the hitchhiker had lowered their arm. They hadn't stepped closer to the road, but the shadow had reached the asphalt, crossed the white edge line like spilled ink. I tightened my hands on the wheel. "Okay," I murmured to myself. My voice sounded too loud inside the car. I told myself it was perspective. The slope of the shoulder, maybe. The beam of the headlights hitting uneven ground. But the shadow moved again. Another slow slide. It crept over the asphalt toward the center line, its shape subtly wrong now. The arm too long. The shoulder bending at an angle that didn't match the person standing above it. I pressed the brake lightly. The car slowed to a crawl. For a moment everything held still. The hitchhiker, the trees, the wide quiet road. Then I noticed the second problem. It appeared in the corner of my vision, inside the car. A dark shape on the dashboard. At first I thought it was the steering wheel shadow. But the interior dome light was off, and the only illumination came from the instrument panel. There shouldn't have been a shadow at all. Yet something long and thin stretched across the textured plastic of the dash, pointing toward my chest. I stared at it. The shape matched the one outside. An arm, extended. My throat tightened. I lifted my right hand from the wheel. The shape on the dashboard didn't move. Outside, the hitchhiker remained perfectly still. But the shadow on the road slid another inch closer to the car. And the one inside moved with it. It crept over the dashboard seam and onto the edge of the steering column. I felt a small, controlled breath leave my mouth. There had to be a reflection. Headlight glare bouncing off the windshield. Some optical thing. I leaned sideways slightly and looked at the glass. The windshield reflected the dashboard lights faintly. The empty passenger seat. My own pale face hovering in the darkness. No external light source behind me. No object casting a shadow forward through the glass. Still the shape moved. The tip of the shadow touched the base of the steering wheel. Outside, the shadow had reached the center of the road. The hitchhiker finally moved. Just one step forward. Their boots scuffed the gravel softly, barely audible over the low idle of the engine. But the shadow didn't move with them. It stayed anchored to the asphalt. Instead it changed angle. The arm bent upward at the elbow and pointed more directly toward my seat. I felt something tighten in my chest. My headlights flickered slightly as the engine idled. For a moment the beam dimmed. The shadow surged forward. Inside the car, the dark line slid across the wheel and reached the top of my left hand. I jerked back instinctively. The shadow remained. It lay across my knuckles like a thin band of oil. I stared down at it. The temperature inside the car hadn't changed, but the skin under the shadow felt oddly muted. Not cold, just distant, like touching a numb patch of flesh. I slowly turned my head back toward the road. The hitchhiker was looking directly at me now. I couldn't see their face clearly in the headlights, just a pale oval above the collar of the jacket. But their body hadn't moved again. They stood at the shoulder exactly where they had before, several feet behind the place where the shadow now stretched. The shadow was no longer attached to their feet. It had separated entirely. The shape on the road pulled outward across the asphalt until it touched the front bumper of my car. Then it began climbing, not upward in a straight line. It flowed over the chrome edge of the grille and spread slowly across the hood, flattening against the metal like spilled ink finding new surface. Inside the car, the shadow on my hand lengthened. The tip slid past my wrist, up my forearm, still pointing, always pointing. I lifted my eyes again. The hitchhiker remained motionless at the roadside, but the ground around them was empty now. No shadow at their feet, just the pale beam of my headlights illuminating bare gravel. And as the dark shape crept higher along my arm, reaching for my shoulder, I realized the person standing by the road wasn't waiting for a ride. They were only standing where their shadow used to be. The fog ahead formed a silhouette that didn't move as I approached. At first I thought it was a trick of the headlights, one of those shapes the brain invents when light hits fog at the wrong angle. A column of mist, maybe, or a thicker pocket of air drifting across the road. But the longer I drove, the more it held its shape. Two narrow shoulders. Ahead, arms hanging down. Someone standing in the middle of the road. I eased my foot off the gas. The highway had been empty for at least an hour. I'd passed the last gas station somewhere behind the mountains, an island of fluorescent light surrounded by trees, and after that the road turned narrow and dark, threading through a forest that pressed close to the asphalt. No towns, no houses, no signal bars on my phone, just fog. It had rolled in gradually, at first a thin veil drifting between the trunks of the trees, then thicker, heavier. Now it filled the headlights like smoke, flattening distance into a white wall. The silhouette stood about 50 yards ahead. It didn't move, not even slightly. If it was a person, they should have reacted by now. The car wasn't quiet. The engine hummed steadily, tires whispering over the pavement. The beams of my headlights were bright enough to turn the fog into a glowing tunnel. Still the figure remained. I slowed to 30. The fog behaved strangely around the silhouette. Instead of drifting through it the way fog normally would, it curved around the shape, like water sliding past a stone in a stream. Thin ribbons of mist flowed along the outline of the shoulders and pooled around the legs. But the center stayed clear. Empty. Perfect silhouette cut out of white. I leaned forward slightly, squinting through the windshield. The closer I got, the more wrong it felt. The shape never grew larger. It stayed the same size, same proportions, same distance, no matter how far the car rolled forward. I tapped the brake gently. The car slowed to 25. The silhouette remained exactly where it was, 50 yards ahead. I checked the speedometer again, Then the road markers. The dash center lines slid under the car one after another, proving I was moving. But the figure refused to draw nearer. The fog thickened as I drove. It pressed against the windshield in slow currents, turning the beams of the headlights into long cones of pale light. And the silhouette stayed fixed inside them. Not closer, not farther, just there. The first real unease came when I noticed the sound. Or rather, the lack of it. The road should have had texture, small cracks, the faint rhythmic thump of tires passing over seams in the asphalt. Even inside a car you hear it, a subtle pulse under the engine noise. But now there was only the engine, a low, steady hum. The tires sounded muted, as though the pavement had softened beneath them. I cracked the window an inch. Cold fog slipped inside immediately, carrying the faint smell of wet leaves and something metallic, like old rainwater in a rusted gutter. But there were no forest sounds, no insects, no wind in the branches. The world outside the headlights had gone completely still. I closed the window. The silhouette waited ahead, unchanged. I glanced at the clock on the dashboard. 2:11 a.m. I could have sworn it had been around 1:50 the last time I checked. Maybe I'd misremembered. I looked back at the road. The silhouette had shifted. Not position, posture. The arms were slightly farther apart now, the shape wider through the shoulders. I sat up straighter in the seat. I knew I hadn't blinked long enough to miss movement. The road ahead had stayed in my sight the entire time. Yet the outline had changed. The fog bent around it more sharply now, as if the shape had grown edges. I slowed to 20. The headlights flickered faintly through the mist, scattering light in 1,000 tiny reflections. For a moment the silhouette looked almost solid. Then the light shifted and it became hollow again, a cutout in the fog. I tried to judge the distance using the roadside reflectors. The next post should have appeared in the beams by now. Didn't. Another 30 seconds passed. Still no reflector. My stomach tightened. I glanced down at the odometer. The numbers were rolling normally, but the road wasn't changing. The fog ahead remained identical. Same curls of mist. Same pale swirls caught in the light. The silhouette waited in the center of it. Exactly 50 yards away. I reached over and tapped the radio out of habit. Static filled the car immediately. Thin, dry noise with no station beneath it. I twisted the dial slowly. Nothing. Just static. But underneath the hiss there was a faint rhythm. A low pulsing. Not quite mechanical. More like breathing. I shut the radio off. The silence that followed felt thicker than before. I looked back at the silhouette. It had changed again. The head was tilted now, slightly to one side, watching, or listening. I felt the urge to turn the car around. The road behind me had vanished into fog as well, but at least it led somewhere I'd already been. Yet something about the road ahead held me in place. The silhouette didn't feel like a person blocking the road. Felt like a marker, a fixed point. I eased the car forward again. The fog responded immediately. It began to move, not drifting but flowing. Long strands of mist slid past the windshield in slow, deliberate currents, always toward the silhouette. As if drawn there, the headlights bent strangely through the shifting vapor. Shapes formed and collapsed in the light, faint suggestions of figures standing beyond the road. But every time I focused on one, it dissolved. Except for the silhouette. That one never changed. I rubbed my eyes and glanced down at the dashboard again. The clock read 2:11. The same minute. I frowned. The engine had been running at least 10 minutes since I'd last checked. Yet the second indicator hadn't moved. A small digital colon blinked between the numbers. But the time stayed frozen. 2:11. I felt a slow pressure building behind my ears. Something about the air in the car felt thick, as if the fog outside had seeped through the vents. I looked back at the road. The silhouette remained ahead, still 50 yards away, still tilted slightly to one side. And now the fog behind it had begun to stack upward, not rising like smoke, building, layer upon layer of pale vapor climbing into the darkness above the trees. I realized then that the fog wasn't spreading across the forest the way natural fog should. It wasn't drifting along the ground. Every strand of it was moving toward the silhouette, toward that empty shape in the road. The fog slid along the asphalt, through the trees, across the hood of the car. All of it flowing forward, feeding the outline. The silhouette didn't move because it didn't need to. It was holding the fog in place, anchoring it. I stared into the headlights, watching the pale currents rush toward that hollow figure. And after a while I understood the final, quiet wrongness of the scene. The fog wasn't forming the silhouette. The silhouette was the only place the fog refused to enter. As if something was already standing there. Something so solid the entire forest's worth of mist had to flow around it.